On the 5th of January 1942, as exultant shouts of victory resounded in the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Laroku Yamamoto instructed the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to begin preparing for the second stage of operations in the Pacific War. His study of the situation, reports on the Philippines, Malaya, and points south, indicated that Japanese troops in a few months would be in control of East Asia and the other areas they had attacked in December, so Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Madame Ugaki, that he wanted the plans to be completed by the middle of February. The speed with which the Japanese had conquered the Western Pacific astounded the planners in Tokyo and brought about sharp disagreement within the Imperial General Staff. The ardent military nationalists wanted to press on as long as Japan was victorious, no matter how far afield such planning led. Another group, represented by Admiral Yamamoto, had been less than enthusiastic about the opening of war with the United States and Britain, and worried about the future. One reason Yamamoto was at sea aboard the Combined Fleet flagship Yamato was that friends on the Imperial General Staff had worried that if he remained in Tokyo, he would be assassinated because of his public opposition to unlimited war. Even now, his opinions were no secret from those around him. His chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, wrote in his diary about the need for far-sighted statesmanship following this first month of glorious victory. Those were words that Yamamoto often used in warning that Japan could not war on the Western powers and hoped to win in the long run. Yamamoto's open criticism of the politicians was aimed at Prince Kuno and others who did not seem to know what sort of war Japan should wage in the Pacific. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with a friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusu-do organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto, warning his friend that war was inevitable because of decisions taken by the politicians, said that at first, "We'll have everything our own way, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles." And now, just a month after the war had begun, the octopus was spread almost flat. Yamamoto, however, had also warned his old friend that the euphoria could not last. The time, he said, for political action was the moment that Singapore fell. That disaster would unsettle the British in India, and they would undoubtedly be willing to listen to talk of peace. Yamamoto knew the British well. He had been a member of the delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He also knew the Americans, and he had been Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 198. He agreed that once war was started by the politicians, a major victory must be won quickly. But when that victory was achieved, he believed Japan would have only a year and a half to bask. "Glory, we must get a peace agreement by then," he told Sasakawa, and he looked to this old friend to carry the word among the right-wing political leaders who were in power on January 5. The victory seemed close at hand. The American battleship fleet had been put out of action at Pearl Harbor on December 7. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk off the Malay coast in the Philippines, Manila, and the United States naval base at Cavite had been captured. The British had surrendered at Hong Kong, and Japanese forces were on their way to new landings in the Dutch East Indies at Rabaul on New Ireland, Amba, and in the Solomon Islands. The attack at Pearl Harbor, however, had not accomplished all Yamamoto had hoped for. The destruction of the major elements of the United States fleet, the aircraft carriers which had been at sea, were unharmed and represented a constant threat. What was needed was a spectacular achievement, and Yamamoto did not expect the fall of Singapore for 5 or 6 months. It came on February 15. He believed that if he was to achieve his goal of setting up the stage for negotiation, he must move in another direction. But the question before his planners was where to strike next. The army vetoed Yamamoto's suggestion for an attack on the Soviet Union. Such a war would be fought almost entirely on land, and the army was heavily occupied in China and Southeast Asia, so 3 other ideas were offered. Yamamoto's favorite was to attack in the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet, and destroy it, as Yamamoto had destroyed the American ships at Pearl Harbor, and then push into the Middle East to link up with the Germans who were driving toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. Thus, the Japanese Navy would be assured of all the oil it needed. The Army refused to consider a Middle Eastern operation. So only two plans were left. One, advocated by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of that forward base of operations. After moving into the Solomon Islands, the Navy would take New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Advocates of this plan at Imperial General Headquarters were already setting up occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand. But Yamamoto did not like the Australia plan, because he thought it would take too long and still would not be spectacular enough to halt the Americans. Yamamoto also knew the Pearl Harbor attack had aroused the spirit of vengeance in people the Japanese had been learning to detest as soft and incompetent. Too soft, the Army said, to fight a war to the finish. It was apparent that even the capture of Singapore would not stop the Americans. Yamamoto wanted a victory that would make it possible for Japan to extend a generous olive branch. In January, Yamamoto ordered another plan drawn, and 2 months later sent officers to Tokyo with the document designated the Me Plan, which envisaged a battle off Midway Island, where the American carrier force would be destroyed. He also sent to Tokyo the AL Plan, which detailed the invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went well, Hawaii would be occupied, and later perhaps the West Coast. At least victories at Midway and in the Oceans would give the politicians a base for negotiating the sort of peace that Yamamoto hoped to achieve in Tokyo. The admirals quarreled around the conference table in the Navy Ministry. But in the end, Yamamoto had his way. Forgot was the potential significance of the fall of Singapore in February and the impending collapse of Baton and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's purpose. The reason they were no longer important lay in the April raid of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron on Tokyo. The Doit raid had shocked the Japanese into a realization that the Americans were only beginning to fight in June. After the Midway operation flamed into disaster for Japan, there was no time for recrimination. Indeed, the Army did not even know the full extent of the defeat. The news of the destruction of 4 big fleet carriers was carefully suppressed so that it was known only at the highest levels of the Navy. While Yamamoto had been off on his Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had moved the Navy and its air forces steadily southward to set up the forthcoming attempt to cut off Australian naval forces. Had taken Rabaul on January 23, and from that time onward, they had conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands and New Guinea. It was apparent to the Australians, who communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur after his arrival in March, that the Japanese would soon move against New Guinea. If they were successful, it would be very nearly a walkover for the Japanese to take northern Australia in February. The Japanese had already bombed Darwin, and in March, when they invaded Samoa, New Guinea, the pace stepped up. In May, just before the Midway battle, the Japanese sent an occupation force toward Port Moresby, but it was turned back by the fierce defense of the Americans and Australians in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did occupy Chalagi north of Guadalcanal and built a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced plan in Washington and Australia that they had to prepare for a Japanese move in the South. MacArthur told the Australian government it must be ready for an attack before a Japanese thrust that was generally expected to be made against India. He cabled General Marshall for 2 carriers and 1,000 planes, but in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall that until the end of June he would have only 2 working carriers in the entire Pacific, while on the eve of Midway the Japanese had 10, and Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already given advanced warning about the big move he expected the Japanese to make, which turned out to be the Midway battle. While events were taking their course at Midway, the Japanese were establishing their forces in the New Guinea Solomons area. Major General Tamaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salawa, and the naval troops occupied Leh and began to build up an air base there. Independently of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation, and Lieutenant General Harukichi Hatake was ordered to press on toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to be ready to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July. That would be after the Midway battle, when Admiral Yamamoto could be expected to have returned with his combined fleet. That big carrier force was expected to protect this new move in spite of the defeat at Midway, which was reported as a victory to the forces in the field. Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its plans a few days after Midway. The Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were ready to move in view of the Midway victory. MacArthur suggested that the Allies make a preemptive attack on the New Britain, New Ireland area, and then an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base in the area, with the 2 carriers and the 1-0 planes and an amphibious division. MacArthur would force the Japanese back to True on June 12. General Marshall offered the MacArthur plan to Admiral King with some modification. He wanted 3 carriers instead of 2 and 1 Marine division, and 3 Army divisions to make the assaults. Admiral King opposed the idea because it would put MacArthur in command of the Fighting Kings. Other reasons were supplementary. The carriers would be subject to land-based attack, and they would not have enough protection. As it turned out, the Navy had to cope with both of these tactical problems at Guadalcanal. King devised his own plan, a drive from the new herds by forces under Navy command. MacArthur objected to having his Army forces serve under the Navy, but nobody could deny the necessity of stopping the Japanese before they took New Guinea and were poised to attack Australia. The problem for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was who was going to command the operation. They gave Phase 1 the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands to Lagi and adjacent positions to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was just a spot on the map with no known tactical or strategic value. It did not even merit a name in this JCS plan. General MacArthur was thrown a ESOP. After Phase 1, he was to take over and mop up the Japanese in the rest of the Solomons. Rabaul and New Guinea. Admiral King was given his way because the Joint Chiefs of Staff recognized that King had already planned a defense line down the Pacific to protect Australia, and his plan would need relatively less force than MacArthur's. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had weeded General Arnold into sending several squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes there. He had reinforced Samoa and Epate in the new herds, and he planned to put a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness at the time of the Wake Island crisis had aroused King's annoyance, was shipped off to a newly established unit called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Smith were told to develop new techniques for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested that the first effort must be to hold the line in the South Pacific while training the amphibious forces. The second stage would be a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would involve seizure of Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth stage would take the Allies either to the Dutch East Indies or to the Philippines. Admiral King approved this plan. It was just what he himself envisioned, and he made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gorley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and told him to get ready to take over as commander of the amphibious operation. All this was done even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Chilagi. Vice Admiral Gorley left Washington on May 1. He would take command of the South Pacific Force on June 19. But first, he had to go to Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Nimitz, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley got to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive was already beginning in the South Pacific. On May 22, an Army plane saw a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested that the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield there. On June 25, Army intelligence reported that the grass on the island's central plain had been burned off, and tents had gone up in the area. A wharf was under construction at Lunger. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that construction of an airfield was only awaiting the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even knew the names the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, which were the equivalent of American CB units. This information was confirmed in a radio interception made by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet's radio intelligence group, which had broken parts of the Japanese naval code, picked up a message saying that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4, and Fleet Intelligence put two and two together. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day on his way to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report, Admiral Turner knew where he was going it could be no place but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, the former Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His task was to train a whole amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner began to move ships and men around, Admiral Gormley was on his way to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand with his head full of gloomy thoughts about the foolishness of trying to stage an amphibious operation when no one knew how to do it. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the plan, agreed with him entirely. They also agreed that, with the planes at hand, they could not guarantee the landing sufficient air coverage. After all, this meeting occurred on July 18, and the landings were to be made in 3 weeks. They sent a dispatch back to Washington recommending that the operation be deferred, but King was not happy with that message. King had told his new commander that he was handing him a difficult job, and that he would not be able to give him the proper tools until perhaps the fall. The answer was no. The invasion would proceed as planned. Now Gorley had left Washington, convinced that the United States was not ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His gloom increased when he tried and failed to get CBS and other units sent immediately to New Zealand from beginning. The Guadalcanal invasion plan was notable for failures of intelligence. All concerned commands knew that an operation was in the offing, particularly after July 10, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley his operations orders. The major Japanese airbase was located at Rabaul. Planes from those fields could stop at Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia. There was no doubt that they could strike a deadly blow at the Allied buildup. But on July 10, the Allied intelligence services report reaching King contained only a casual comment about airfield construction at Guadalcanal, and a few days later, a report located the field on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield and back at Combined Fleet Headquarters. In Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders that the first staged mission would leave Rabaul on August 14. As commander of the overall United States operation, Admiral Gorley tried desperately to get more help to build advanced bases to bring in more planes, but everywhere he turned, he learned the truth of Admiral King's assertion that he would not be able to provide Gormley with proper tools. The supplies of the invasion forces, for example, were loaded hodgepodge aboard the transports at Oakland. There were plenty of docks, so that the ships could have been unloaded and reloaded with supplies in the order of their intended use. Instead, the ships were sent to Numa, which had had no such facilities, and Admiral King had at least a general idea of the difficulties. But there was not time for delay. King knew better than any of his subordinates the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they got to Australia. The timetable remained. By late July, the rush was on, and 177,000 Marines were moving by troop ship from California, Pearl Harbor, Numa, and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too busy to hold a conference of his commanders. But on July 28, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was supposed to be in tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders met to talk about the invasion, and Admiral Fletcher was to protect the invasion with his task force. Admiral Turner was to deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vander. Once the Marines had taken the island, garrison troops would be brought in. But so hastily was this operation called that no one had made provision for any troops to be held in reserve. There were no more men available in the South Pacific. The meeting on the Saratoga was not a happy one. Fletcher began by announcing that he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. he insisted, and Gurley's staff members at the meeting concurred that the carriers must not be risked. Fletcher was Gunchy 31 that the whole operation was cockeyed hasty, and doomed Admiral Turner, who had a better idea of the global military picture than any other man in the cabin that day, chided his superior. There was no point in that sort of argument, he said, and the decision had been made to risk all. It was their job to carry out orders. Fletcher ought to have known all that after Coral Sea. Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's constant avoidance of action that he had insisted Admiral Nimitz ascertain the condition of Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz was a kindly man, and he liked Fletcher. He had given the carrier commander a pep talk, and then when the Battle of Midway was won, Fletcher, who was in command, there could hardly be faulted. But on the eve of the American offensive operation, to warn the troops and the men of the support ships that he was going to desert them in 48 hours, was a most inauspicious beginning. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion was staged on July 28 and lasted 3 days. The scene was Kororo Island near Fiji. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to get ashore, and when they did, they didn't know what to do. General Vandergrift regarded the mock-up as a complete bust, but there was no time even to second-guess. On July 31, the Marines were back aboard the transports heading for Guadalcanal on the afternoon of August 6. As the task force of 75 ships neared the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously broke away with his carriers. He would have his planes over the landing force as promised, but the 26 ships of the carrier group were being taken as far from harm's way as possible if American intelligence was so faulty as to permit the Japanese buildup of the airfield at Guadalcanal. Japanese intelligence was faultier, for, as the United States invasion fleet massed in the South Pacific, the Japanese had no inkling of a forthcoming attack in July 1942. The Japanese army was preoccupied with trying to capture New Guinea as a staging point for its operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tamaro H's South Seas Force landed 2,000 troops near Buona. After capturing Buona, the Japanese planned to construct airfields there as a prelude to a new attack on Port Moresby. So, in July, Japanese air power was concentrated against Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters swept over the piers and airfields nearly every day after the Japanese landings. The Japanese AI forces were also called on to support the beachhead, and in the early days of August, their attention was fixed on the new drive. The combined Australian and American Air Force responded with raids on the Japanese airbases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was anchored at Hashima in Japanese waters in a leisurely fashion. He was preparing for the forthcoming air operations over Australia, and he would see then what action was to be taken next. In preparation, on August 3, the naval air groups stationed at La were brought back to Rabaul to be ready for the Guadalcanal operations that would begin the following week. During the first week of August, the South Pacific skies were cloudy, and only a handful of Japanese search planes took to the skies. None of them found the American armada that was steaming toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese airmen flying out of Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft in the skies around Buea. They had been told that the United States carriers were destroyed at Midway. The pilots assumed that the carriers were operating with Australian forces that had marched across the Owen Stanley Mountains. Actually, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in the field suspected a forthcoming invasion. After their 8 months of continuous victories, it was hard for the Japanese to believe that the Allies could launch a seaborne invasion. Had the idea been suggested, they would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gorley that such an invasion had almost no chance of success. So as the American Expeditionary Force moved toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed the element of surprise. On August 4 and 5, the 75 ships steamed on under an overcast sky, and on August 6 the fleet moved through rain squalls almost all day long. But as dawn rose on the morning of August 7, the sky cleared, which meant the carrier planes would have good visibility for their attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30, and at 6:00 the carriers launched their first strike. The planes from the Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal Island, T. Lagi Gavutu, and Tano, the Japanese had established a SC plane base on Gavutu and Tan Mogo, which were connected by a causeway. The Japanese planes had been kept down the day before by bad weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified aircraft during the day, but whether it was Japanese or a plane from General MacArthur's command was undetermined. In any event, the Japanese were not aroused until 6:12 a.m. when the communications headquarters at the Tagi SC plane base sent a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message went to the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleet's Admiral Yamamoto and Imperial headquarters. It was simple and succinct: enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The weather had cleared, and the car planes flew off into scattered cumulus clouds in the light of a quarter moon. The fighters and bombers moved off on their appointed missions. 8 fighters, led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer, took off from the Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They found no aircraft and no PT boats, and they did strafe the buildings on the airfield at Longer Point. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from the Enterprise maintained a combat air patrol over the transport sports from 6 until 8:00, when they were replaced by others. Bombers began to hit Tagi and the Lure Point area, but no enemy air activity was seen all morning. The Americans had it all to themselves, and the only planes damaged were those hurt in operational accidents. Planes from the other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavutu. The surprise was complete. The American planes arrived and began bombing and strafing the seaplanes in the water. They destroyed 9 float planes similar to the 014-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that doubled as search planes and bombers. A few Japanese pilots who tried to take off were shot down before they were airborne. Single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived the attack. Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Chalagi. Some struck targets on the beaches that the Marines would soon invade before dawn. The Marines on the decks of the transports could see the high mountains of the island that was their objective. The transport slipped through the narrow neck that runs between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Siak Channel. As dawn rose, the guns of the escorting warships fired, and flashes of light illuminated the fleet. There was virtually no answering fire. The bombardment from the cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troop ships started fires along the shore. An oil dump exploded, sending flames leaping into the sky at 8:00. After 2 hours of bombing and shelling of the island, the landing craft began to move toward the north shore east of Longer Point. The Marines were nervous. Neither they nor their officers had any practical experience in such a landing, for this was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9:00, troops were landing on Guadalcanal. They met no resistance because the Japanese had fled into the hills. The going was ridiculously easy. The Marines soon saw how completely they had surprised the enemy. They came A.C. Ross wooden barracks that had never been slept in. They found a tent with a breakfast table full of platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. There were half-filled rice bowls scattered around, chopsticks hastily dropped on the table or on the straw mats of the floor. The tents themselves told why the Japanese had left so rapidly. They were torn by shrapnel, and some were knocked flat by the shelling of the naval vessels before the landing. But any Marine who felt like celebrating over the ease with which they had taken their early objectives had some shocks coming. It was true that the Japanese had been surprised on Guadalcanal, and they had not dug in yet nor created permanent fortifications, because most of the men were construction troops, not fighting men. But over on Tagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines had encountered stout resistance. About 250 Japanese were located on this island. The Japanese were troops of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Hasek Miyazaki. They were